Hey folks, here's our first lecture for the reading for the first week on Persuasion and Propaganda. And what you're going to do for most of this week is try and figure out what's the difference between persuasion and propaganda. Where's the line that we draw? And big picture, propaganda uses persuasive strategies, but it differs from persuasion in the purpose. So persuasion, at its most basic, is usually defined as a communication process to influence others. And the two main criteria here are that it is voluntary and that it's mutually beneficial. So both people, persuader and persuadee, get something out of the communication. You do definitely want to think of persuasion on an ethical continuum. So some things are clearly examples of ethical persuasion. For instance, a doctor trying to convince a patient to get more exercise, making it clear that the doctor has no vested interest. So the doctor is not trying to direct the patient to a gym that they have a financial stake in, but just purely that the doctor is concerned about the patient. Here's their recommendation. Does the doctor try and figure out how to convince the patient to get more exercise? Don't know what that was, but we'll continue on. Okay, further down on the ethical continuum might be an example of a used car salesperson trying to negotiate the purchase price of a car. This is persuasion. It meets the definition of persuasion because both people get something. Most people hopefully understand when they go into any sort of car dealership that there is a negotiation process that they will need to engage in. And the car salesperson is going to try and use strategies to get the highest price possible. The person who is buying the car is going to use strategies to try and buy the car for the lowest price possible. But this is all apparent. Everybody who's entering into this negotiation knows what's happening. So it's still considered ethical as long as there's nothing underhanded going on about the car doesn't function as advertised. But then, for the further along the continuum you get closer to trying to figure out what's propaganda and what is less ethical persuasion. So a really bright example of clear propaganda is when Hitler and the Nazis were trying to convince French soldiers during World War II that the British were raping their wives and daughters. There was nothing mutually beneficial about this. They were lying because they wanted the French to ally with them and not the British. So let's talk about the basic definition of propaganda. Jowett and O'Donnell, the folks who your reading is from, have this really very specific, easy to pick out definition. So propaganda is the deliberate, systematic attempt to shape perceptions, manipulate cognitions, and direct behavior to achieve a response that furthers the desired intent of the propagandist. So the key to this definition is that it is not mutually beneficial. The propagandist is going to do whatever it takes in order to get their desired ends. Okay, so your textbook authors, Jowett and O'Donnell, have separated propaganda, their definition, into three different categories. So this definition of white propaganda sounds really similar to persuasion, and it is. The key difference, though, is that still the information that's being provided is for the sole purpose of promoting a specific ideology. So there may even be a benefit to the listener, but that's not any concern of the propagandist. So one of the words that you're going to find over and over in your reading this week is the word ideology. And so the first activity that you do this week, one of the things I'm going to ask you to do is find a definition of ideology. Okay. The second example is black propaganda, which is, I don't know why this message keeps coming up, sorry for that, is very clear. The source of the message is concealed, or They're pointing you in a different direction about who the source is. It's absolute lies. There's this great story from the 1930s about this guy named John Spivak who really wanted the United States to get involved in what was going on in Europe. And so he printed these books that are, they're conspiracy theories, but they seemed to have excellent research. Of course, he couldn't share with his readers the source of his information. So for instance, there's this quote in the book, which you can find online, Secret Armies Exposing Hitler's Undeclared War on the Americas. There's this quote in the book about this supposed event that took place in June of 1934, where 2,500 Nazis and their friends were at a meeting dressed in stormtrooper outfits. Clearly, this did not happen. So that kind of thing. So one of the things that we need to think about today, we live in an era, because we're now in the internet era, of lots of conspiracy theories. And so we need to be good about critically thinking, what is the conspiracy theorists' agenda? What are they hoping that will come out of their misinformation? And that can help us figure out what really is going on behind their message. Okay, and then the last thing we're going to talk about in this lecture is gray propaganda that falls somewhere in between white and black. So maybe the source is correctly identified, maybe it's not. The accuracy of the information might be uncertain. One of the criteria for the reading, though, is that gray propaganda tends to be widespread. So there's this great recent example from 2003. So in October 2003, we've just recently, a few months before, invaded Iraq. And there was a lot of criticism in the media about whether or not America should have done this. And all of a sudden, these letters from soldiers started appearing in local newspapers that were supposedly written by soldiers, telling the folks back home what their experiences were and what they were seeing. And again, we live in the internet era, and so it was really easy to see that these letters were, the same exact letter was being disseminated all over the country. And so the question became, were these ethical? Because supposedly all the soldiers whose names were put to these letters had agreed to the content, but they hadn't actually written the content. So, this is definitely falling somewhere onto the less ethical continuum. So that's the kind of stuff you're going to be reading about and thinking about this week. And we're at about 8.5 minutes. I'm going to try and make these shorter as we go along. Thanks, folks.